Good evening, everyone. Hello, my name is Carolyn Music. I'm the Chair of Christian Thought at the University of Calgary. It's lovely to see you. We thought we should start. There will be people trickling in, but that's okay. So what I'd like to say is that we're going to begin with Reverend Tony Snow smudging for us. Thank you.
Dagun Chawa Mintauncha Stabi. This is our traditional greeting in the Stoney language. I come from the Stoney Nakoda people. My father was the chief of our reserve for 30 years and a theologian himself. He was an ordained minister with the United Church of Canada. His father used to go out to our reserve and preach with people. So he would take the Cree Bible and he would act as a lay minister, even though no one told him to do this. It's a long tradition in our family about this calling towards a Christian identity, a religious identity, a connection to our faith. My grandfather before my father was a Sundance maker. And so that's a holy person, a person who follows and lives in a certain way, and we try to emulate that in our tradition. In our language, when we first met the missionaries that came in, they called them Bakone Wichasta, which means the one who speaks with God. And this moniker, this identifier, is the same thing that we call our pipe carriers, our holy men, holy women. And in our tradition, there's no difference between the minister and the ceremonialist. We accept and understand the role of both. And so as we continue to live in this world, in this tradition, it's not so different that we observe our traditional customs like the smudge, like the Sundance, like the pipe ceremony. We continue to utilize these tools, these teachings, these lessons in our work within the church. And so for our last AGM for the Chinook Winds region, which covers all of southern Alberta, and I'm the Indigenous minister for that region for all the 90 churches in the area. We had a pipe ceremony to begin to offer a blessing and a prayer. The things would go, as we say, in a good way, but things would go according to our tradition, according to our custom, to honor these traditions. And that's one of the reasons why we do these smudges in these spaces. In large part, we do this because this had been banned in our tradition, in our history. We were not allowed to practice our traditional customs, our religious ceremonies. And so to come today to do that is a monumentous thing. And it shows how much we have grown, how much we have learned from one another, how we begin to understand one another, and the reason why we have things like reconciliation. So we will begin with a smudge. And this is a gathering of medicinal plants and herbs from the mountains, gathered by our warriors, we gathered by our different individuals. They are prepared by a holy woman. They are prepared by and consecrated by, prayed over, and mixed in a way that offers a blessing to all those that come to this event. So I will smudge here at the front, and then I will turn this over to the next speaker. And as we gather in these spaces and to talk about difficult things, it is important that we remember the foundations of our belief, the foundations of our understanding, that through something like the smudge, we offer a healing, we offer a perspective, It may not be for everyone, but we are here to share what we know, here to share what we understand. We take this as a humble beginning, as a way of humility. And for that, I will offer my father's closing prayer. Before he passed away, he offered a prayer which is a 4 directions prayer. Let us pray. Wakti abio shiganama ka shnisha hibini, ade makochi garen, nanga ambne, iningi pabich. Wahina pinchagya nagine inigi pabich osinginab. Anokine nechagya naginish inigi pabich osinginab. Yaistya ya nechagya naginish inigi pabich osinginab. Wahyamba wajin chagya naginish chasta tanga cha nagene inigi pabich osinginab. Makoya debi inigi pabich osinginab. Ina makoche inigi pabich osinginab. Ade makochi garen inigi pabich osinginab. We offer this as a blessing to all those that gather, that hear this story, and that we move toward a better understanding together through the guidance of these blessings. Amen.
Thank you. What I'd like to do now is to introduce Dr. Jeff Logan. He is a member of the Advisory Council of the Chair of Christian Thought, and he represents the Baptist Union of Western Canada, and he will be doing the land acknowledgement.
Thank you. Welcome to the Confluence site and Parkland. We are gathered here today in the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai Nations, the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Goodstoney First Nations, and the Tsuut'ina Nation. This is also homeland of the historic Northwest Métis and the Otemaewishuk Métis government, Nose Hill Métis District 5, and Elbow Métis District 6. The Confluence historic site is located where the Bow River meets the Elbow River. This site has long been called Mohkinstsis by the Blackfoot, Winchispa by the Nakota, and Gut'istse by Tsuut'ina, and it is the birthplace of the city of Calgary. Miigwech.
Okay, so I'd like to first begin telling you a little bit about the named lecture, who it's in memory of. The Chair of Christian Thought organizes 4 public lectures a year. And tonight we're organizing, I've organized a lecture, this endowed lecture, in memory of Jean-Louis Lebel. Louis Lebel was a businessman and a scholar. He was the 3rd Chancellor of the University of Calgary as well, from 1978 to 1982. And he joined with Dr. Peter Craigie to actually plan the fundraising for the Chair of Christian Thought initiative, and which emerged in 1985 as the Chair of Christian Thought that we have today. Louis Lebel also was a born leader. He was remarkably active in many communities and also in many charities, especially well-being services, including the Calgary United Appeal, the Vanier Institute, the Canadian Institute for Child Health, the Alberta Health Foundation, and Boy Scouts, among many others. I had to cut the list in half. It was quite long. In 1985, the university recognized Louis Lebel's many contributions by granting him an honorary doctorate. It is a privilege to hold an annual lecture in Christian ethics in the name of Jean-Louis Lebel. So now what I'd like to do is introduce tonight's speaker, who we already met. but I'd like to introduce Reverend Tony Snow in more detail. Reverend Snow is a member of the Stoney Nakoda First Nation and the regional Indigenous minister for the Chinook-Wins region, southern Alberta, for the United Church of Canada, where he oversees relationship building, outreach, and reconciliation programming for denominational, ecumenical, and interfaith institutions and organizations. He has worked for several years in communication, public engagement, and government relations. He has worked for his ministry focuses on bridging non-Indigenous community reconciliation programs with Indigenous neighbors to promote cultural resiliency, advocacy, and healing. Reverend Snow is an intergenerational clergy representative from the Stoney people who, along with his brother Reverend John Snow and his sister student minister Gloria Snow, follow in his father's footsteps, the late Reverend John Snow Sr., in his work to live out the treaty relationship and our covenants with one another. Reverend Snow is a descendant of the signers of Treaty 7 in southern Alberta and a traditional knowledge keeper. In his spare time, he's going to be writing a PhD thesis fairly soon. So please welcome to the podium Reverend Tony Snow, who will deliver the 2025 Chair of Christian Thought Lebel Lecture in Christian Ethics, entitled Reconciliation and Repair, Treaty, Covenant, Relationship, Bond. Tony, thanks.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, an honor to be presenting for the University of Calgary. I graduated from the University of Calgary in the 90s, 1994, and completed a Bachelor of English. And at that time, very difficult to work through a system that is not always welcoming, not always understanding to Indigenous people, to our perspectives, something we had to fight for over time, something that we needed to work through in our various classes with professors and others. So it's nice to be back in this connected way through this long journey, which has taken me into some of our traditional teachings and with our elders, working on traditional land use studies, working with the various community members, working in terms of advocacy and activism for Indigenous issues, especially those that affect many of our young people, many of the women of our reserves, and many of our community members that are two-spirit or otherwise not recognized in our system. And so this journey has taken quite a number of years to kind of crystallize into this talk. I remember going to Ottawa for a conference that I was presenting a blanket exercise and a other talk. And they told me on the Friday night when I showed up, oh, you'll need to talk for the evening here. We have some time set aside for you. Okay. How much time? 2 hours. And so I filled the 2 hours. With this information, it goes into various ways that these talks have developed for a broader audience, for an investigation into who we are and what we understand. For me, it's a lifelong connected journey, seeing where my father tried to move forward in terms of his activism and his work, and also where that directs us in our work, how we work within institutions, within governments, within these paradigms to try to create an opportunity. And so this talk today about reconciliation and about repair is this culmination of these experiences and also the suggested ways in which we are confronting this on an ongoing basis. I find this very timely for the work that we do because there is a connection between this work and where we are today, where we see ourselves today. So I'd like to welcome my brother John here, invited John to come and be part of this because this is not just for one individual. This is the speaking of our people, speaking of our family, speaking of our way of understanding. And so as we begin, I just wanted to acknowledge that while we say land acknowledgements and acknowledge that this country is based on a covenantal foundation, we live together, and we should understand that this covenant began long ago, before these documents were signed, the documents of the treaty, the documents of our recognition. It began in the lives of inhabitants, passing along experiences and knowledge of the things they encountered. It began with understanding certain areas, certain seasons, certain predictabilities that could only help our survivance, not only to survive, but to flourish. It began with a story of love of the earth as a mother to her children. It began with a sense of belonging after generations, millennia after millennia of living with and living in the land. The big test. Here we go. This instruction comes from my father's book, These Mountains Are Our Sacred Places. He says, the old stony medicine man has said, you must continue to go to the sacred mountains. You must fast and pray for many days and nights, and perchance you will see a vision upon the mountains. Before he went to the beautiful land of the spirits beyond the sunset, the old man with a century of experience spoke these words. You must search, and you will find ancient truths and wisdom that shall guide you in the future. He continued, my grandfathers told me these things when I was a little boy, and in my youth it was told to me over and over again by the campfire and then the tribal encampment. And so it has been imprinted in my heart ever since that time. This connection of the belongingness of the land and our understanding of the land that we perform within the land acknowledgement is important. Here we have Mount Iamnathka, what's called Yamnaska. Yamnaska in the Stony language just means messy hair. But Iamnathka, Iya is the term for mountain, and Yamnathka is the sheer face of that mountain. And this is a sacred mountain. This is a holy mountain. It's a mountain where God sits in our land. In a Christian context, we would look at this and say, this is like Mount Zion. This is like Mount Hebron. This is a holy place where the Stony people would go for instruction, for vision quest, for fasting, for praying to God, for taking that time to learn. Today, it is a tourist site. As you can see in the front here, there's a road just at the line of the trees. Up here in front, there's the 1A highway. On that side of the 1A highway is the provincial park, where the mountain is. On the other side of the highway is the Stony Reserve, where the people have their housing. And so this road bisects, creating two sovereignties within this area. The place of our church, the place of our holy land, is off limits to us. Though everyone else can go and climb this mountain, they don't have to observe anything of our traditions within that. And yet, if we go there, we're automatically confronted with game wardens and others. This historically has been the history of trying to go and do what we do in these places. So we have a different experience of our sacred lands, of our sacred connections. And so understanding this in the land acknowledgement is to understand that history and what that's doing and continues to do to the people. Here, Minewanka, Lake Minnewanka. Mine means water, and Waka means spirit. So Minnewanka is a spirit lake. It is a place where people would go for vision quests, to commune with the spirit of that lake, to become healed or informed by wisdom from that lake, to take that back into their life, to bring it back into the community, what they've learned, and to share that. Here, this space also in the Banff area is not a place where we can go and do our ceremonies as we would normally do. To go here would be to run into a lot of tourists, a lot of people with cameras and videoing what you're doing. And so to come here to try to do a smudge is not really feasible. And so we don't do that. We don't talk about the holiness of this lake. In other places, we have recognized lakes that are like this. The lake that's called Wakan Mini is also known as Lac Sainte Anne. It is a stony holy site. And yet today we see Lac Sainte Anne as a big pilgrimage site where the Pope came when he offered the apology in Canada, and where he offered Mass. It has been recognized by several denominations and groups, and every year you have a pilgrimage of people that go there for that purpose, to bathe in the waters, to be baptized in the waters. And so that site, we can see what happens when we bridge that and these understandings come to light in different ways. So again, not a place where we would go to fulfill our traditional requirements. Here, Minihruwin, also called Iache Ar Barbin, is the Caven Basin in Banff. The Caven Basin is something of a miracle in how it's formed as a dome with a hole at the top, and it very much reminiscent of the healing pools that we hear in the Bible. And so these connections of these holy places, as soon as this place was identified, it was shown by Stony guides to the CP rail workers. They informed Ottawa, and immediately in the 1890s, the Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, declared this Canada's first provincial park. And so the Stony people were thrown out of this area. So we could no longer go back to this place, but it became a site for different groups, particularly German groups, to come and have their spa set up. They had a big pool put out there, and we were not allowed to be in these areas. When we talk about the restriction on these areas, if we go to Banff or if we go to Canmore, there's a church, the Ralph Connor United Church, and beside it, there's a couple of buildings, and then down at the end of the corner, there's a RCMP, or Northwest Mounted Police detachment there, a historic building that has in it a jail. And in that jail, that's where the Stony people would be housed if they were found off the reserve. So these ideas that we have around land acknowledgement and the acceptance of presence within these areas is very complicated. Here, Iarhe Tatanga Wehage Wakan is the name of this mountain. Here, I don't know if I have my pointer on, sort of. No, that didn't work. So the mountain that is Tunnel Mountain looks like a buffalo lying on its side. And that mountain is a keystone to the valley. It is a protector of all of the sacred medicines, of all of the sacred waters, of all the healthy and healing components of the community. And it is connected through our teaching about the sacredness of this place. Today, it's called Tunnel Mountain because the people who were putting through the railway wanted to blast a hole through this mountain. And so they designated it Tunnel Mountain, though they never blew the tunnel through it. It remains that way. It was recently renamed by the Stoney people to its original name, original designation, and yet it is there in light of this community that now takes over its resources, that now exploits those resources, and a place where we are not really going back to collect our medicines and these holy places, these holy spaces in these areas. Here at Canmore, we have Ihage Nakota. It is a site named for this mountain, the mountain, two mountain peaks. In the story of this place, it looks like a person lying on their back, their knees in the air. And their knees up, it is a reference to a person who so loved this area, he wanted to stay here forever. He was turned into this mountain. Today it's called Haling Peak. It had a derogatory name before that. In our tradition, we don't name places after ourselves. We don't name them after important people. We name them according to these traditions, these myths, these mystical encounters, things that have happened. In the Stoney tradition, we have names for places all the way from the Northwest Territories, all the way down to Colorado, all the way down to the Apache in the New Mexico area. So we traveled throughout these areas and have names for all the peaks, all the mountains, because of these occurrences, these things that happened or that we remember in our oral traditions. So these connections to the land tell us a great deal about how we are embedded in that story and what they mean to us, how they inform us about the ways of this land and the ways of our connection to these lands have evolved over time. Here, Enukatha Ipa is the Bald Eagle Peak, renamed for this mountain just outside of Canmore, which is similarly derogatorily named. And so to revisit this in a way that honors the voices of our people and the traditions, what this place means, become very important. Here in Kananaskis Lakes, the place called Ozara Imni is a place of convalescence, quietude for leaders to go, to reflect on history, to reflect on things that have happened. This in the Kananaskis area is telling because this year, again, we will have the G7 that is coming to the Kananaskis area. Leaders to come and think about the state of the world, where we are at. I was asked when I was working with the Department of Indian Affairs, Indian Oil and Gas Canada as the communication manager, was asked, what does the name Kananaskis mean? And being the person that I am, I said, it means you're trespassing. But the real name, as we hear, Ka'inashke, this is a person. This is a individual who did a miraculous thing. And so these areas are recognized for that connection. Here, Chwapchinchan Kudebi, Canmore, is a name that says the shooting at the willows. It's interesting to me to have that name because you could have a much more magnanimous name, something that says something about the current history or some other event. It's a telling of a story, and it's kind of this punchline. And yet, that's the name that's being given to that area, that sticks to that area. And to me, it stays that way because the place has not earned its new name. The place has not done the work of reconciliation to become something different in our history. And that's a joint history. That's something that we talk about together. Minerva, the name of this waterfall, Cascade Falls. It is an important keystone in our community. It is the place where we come from. It is the place where we are connected back to this holy area. There's a story of a chief and his wife that threw themselves off the waterfall to save the people. And there are other stories as well. Ways that we remember and use these teachings in our thinking that can help to expand our understanding. Today, we have the town of Banff there. There's a long history of our connection to Banff because of this beginnings of the national park, the first national park in Canada, then excluded the Indigenous people, excluded the Stoney people. There was a train derailment that happened in the 1890s that caused the train to be laid up for a number of weeks. And in that time, the different people, the different leaders in the community had invited the Stoney people, from the White Museum and others that had invited the Stoney people to come and to entertain the visitors who were stranded in Banff. And so they did a powwow, they did some rodeo games, they did a parade through the town, they did a princess pageant. All of these elements later became the Calgary Stampede. So it's only because of these type of incidents, accidents, or tragedies that we start to see some of this history, to see how they've been taken, exploited, reinterpreted to different spaces. And for these stories to ground us, we need to understand and appreciate what was going on in the land, in these communities, between these relationships. Gaharde Medawa Baha is Cochrane. It is the gorge that we see here. It is a reference to that gorge. There's stories about a buffalo jump, stories about other events that happened in this area, and those are all part of the oral tradition of this space and what the community is doing there now. Pagashpu, which is the Paskapoo Slopes area. This is, the Pagashpu translates into the place of the skull. And in our traditional land use study from for the city of Calgary, from the Stoney elders, they identified a number of places that have these Stoney place names that have a connected history about these places in the city. A lot of them have been bulldozed, a lot of them have been erased because of development and other things, but there are still connections and histories that are linked to these spaces. Sage Napabi, Shaganapi is the term for these areas. It's a Stoney person who it talks about his necklace, and that is the claw necklace that he would wear. And so his history is embedded in what we call Shaganapi. Tisatura Tiwapta is Fort Calgary, is the area that we are in right now. It is the name of this structure, this building, a place that the elk would go, the game and animals that would be found. It's also, if we look up in the top corner, across from the lands of Fort Calgary, that is the area in the traditional land use study that the elders identified as where the Stonies would have their encampment. That is the place where our people would gather in this area, the traditional area between these two lakes, the two rivers, that one being the younger brother, which is the Elbow River. So these traditions help to inform our way of understanding the world around us. Here, oh, sorry, I was going to put Airdrie, but I didn't get time to change that. Sugapuda Oyade means the falling star. That's a traditional name of Airdrie. So these places have a connection to what we see in the world and how that information affects the way that our relationships have formed. Here, why do we remember the people's connection to the land? We do this because the land was lost. The connection to the land, the responsibility, like an umbilical cord, was cut. We do this because it was unjustly and erroneously taken when everything the people knew was that there was a sharing agreement in place. That agreement meant that we would carry on our lives and the settlers would carry on theirs. Instead, we live in the tension of misappropriation and dishonest dealings, not an honest exchange as the foundation of our relationship together. The lack of stewardship caused by exclusion to the land has taken a heavy toll. Our exclusion has had repercussions. The song of the land has been cut short, and the spirit of the land has been extinguished and needs rebirth, reparation, rehabilitation, and healing. In the work that we do talking about traditional lands, there's an important connection to these elements of working according to the time and the place and the needs of nature, and of finding that deeper connection of what nature is calling for. As we see from many of the tragedies that are unfolding south of the border and in other places, there's a repercussion to what we do. There's an important connection that we have to remember. And so this story of the land is the story of covenants, of understanding of one's place in the vastness of creation, an inexorable tie to what happens in creation: floods, fires, Chinooks, earthquakes. Each element brings devastation and also brings teachings. In the depth of winter, the winter months, the elders would add an icon, a glyph, symbolizing the story of what happened in that year. A time of famine, a time of great hardship, a time of drought, lessons passed down through the annals of time. And this was called the winter count. And every year, a new image would be added, telling that story of the most important thing that happened that year. A way of recalling our past and a way of teaching us what is to come by remembering where we have been. All of these things have an important part to play in our understanding of the land and of our relationship to one another. As we talk about reconciliation, this is one of those keystones that we must think about. Where today we think about our collective amnesia at a time when we are inundated with facts and story. How are we valuing and compartmentalizing these stories? What would our elders say about the COVID pandemic? What would they say about a world-destroying contagion that had the potential to bring us to the brink of extinction? What would they say about the droughts and fires that filled our air with soot and scarred our lungs? What would they say about the water, the loss of water in our communities at a time of necessary restriction, especially since we didn't carry any community lessons forward to help us to manage water resources in our own houses? What we value is apparency, and what we seek is convenience. What we know is mutable and influenced by the winds of opinion and peer pressure that muddles our perspectives and polarizes our communities. Today, we live in a global society. Conflicts abroad very much come home to roost. Disease is likewise a global traveler, able to jump continents on a whim, and technology itself can be weaponized to be a tool of the disgruntled and the misinformed. For me, all these connections speak to how we are here in this world. It speaks to our histories and our contexts, what we know and what we will admit about ourselves and our pasts. At its core, it tells about what we believe. In Indigenous contexts, these are creation stories, origin stories, stories of explanation, but also stories not of appeasement, but rationalities of connected beliefs. They explain phenomena, they explain outcomes, they explain experiences. In Calgary, we lost our water sources in 2024, became unmoored by the securities of that which sustains us. We reached a boundary, a limit to our practice, a restriction. And for the first time in a long time, we had to contend with the reality of an aging infrastructure, a weakness in our system, a weakness in our way of life. We had to confront fragility. And how we did that tells a lot about ourselves, whether our resilience has any depth, whether we only know how to repair what is and forget about what this is telling us about ourselves and move quickly back into our mode of behavior. COVID taught us the same lesson. When we are confronted with species-ending catastrophe, would we find a quick Band-Aid to the issue and move back into our business as usual? Or would we stop to think that our activities, our global footprint, our tenuous ad hoc systems might need to be reassessed and made more robust for the coming generations? As we think about these efforts, these ways of knowing, there are in our traditions ways that these have been encapsulated by our practice and what we have learned about the world, how we engage in the world together, and how we belong in this space. And a lot of this comes down to what we try to continue to say about this treaty practice. As long as the grass grows and rivers flow is a prayer that speaks to the perpetuity of our relationship upon these lands, between the original people and the newcomers. It is a prayer of hope that we would each extend courtesy and respect for promises made between Creator and in ceremony upon the holy pipe of peace. We acknowledge our relationship with the British Crown and her subjects, who sought peace upon these lands with our ancestors. We acknowledge this act of peacemaking extends to all who seek refuge and sanctuary in these lands. This land is not ours to give. It belongs to Creator. Our story of that peace has not always been lived according to the promises made at the treaty negotiations, and so we continue to seek reconciliation for the actions taken and the hardships endured. The first peoples of this land had traditions of relationship building, which we continue to respect to this day. May our efforts bring balance and resolution to the many injustices committed since the treaty signing. In this way, we think about some of these historical practices. In the East, in Ontario, we have the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, a band of the Seneca, Cayuga, Oneida, Onondaga, and Mohawk nations that came together as a community. Different languages, different cultures, different times, they bound together for their own security. They learned to live with one another, to make covenant with one another through the great tree of peace by the mystic and holy man named the Ganawida, known as the peacemaker. He encouraged them to bury their implements of war beneath a tree of peace, a white pine tree. And so this effort to install a new way began with this ceremony. began with a way in which we can understand a new way of beginning. The making of relatives is a ceremony from the Lakota tradition, our Sioux tradition, that is used to make peace between the Lakota people and the Ree people, the Arikara people. And this was a 4-day ceremony where they progressively met and talked through their differences, their issues. They began a new covenant together, and after the 4th day, they were made relatives of one another. So they could not fight anymore. These are important lessons about how we find roads to reconciliation. A lot of this is not just configuration and talk in Indigenous culture, but it is a practice. When we think about here in Alberta, we have the Bear Hills, which is a site where the peace was made between the Cree people and the Blackfoot people, the Nehiyaw and the Siksika, the Nitsitapi. And what they did was, after fighting and wars that ensued, where some gained the technology of repeating rifles and were able to wipe out other groups, they realized that once the opposing group got the same technology, they would eventually just wipe each other out. And so instead of doing that, they held a pipe ceremony and they prayed and they sought an answer for this impasse. The Cree people and the Blackfoot people are distant relatives. They speak a similar language, an Algonquin language. And so bringing them back together to their center, to that whole, understanding that they needed to find a better way to move forward. They exchanged children. The children would go live in and amongst the other community. They would be cared for and raised in their neighbor's community. And so in that way, they were able to bring about a peace between the two communities, because they couldn't fight themselves. They couldn't fight their own children. This is a relation of the edge of the forest ceremony. It is an Anishinaabe ceremony where they come to bring, new people come from the edge of the forest. They come through the forest to this clearing. And at the time of the encounter, they will brush them from the offenses from their clothing, and they will be allowed into the village. They will be greeted in a way that acknowledges their presence in the new land. When we think about land acknowledgement, we think about coming into a place and having to confront the idea of being a stranger. Here, the practice that already exists in Indigenous culture is a way to subsume that difference and bring about an idea of peace.
You may have picked up things along the way that were unintentional. So before they bring you in, what they say is they unload those thistles. We still use this today. It's a little bit different because instead of building a fire at the edge of the woods, in the language they say they see somebody wandering on the edge of the longhouse, and they don't know who they are. So they make contact with them. So what they say is, "Dengwai wa ishte." So that's what that means, is we'll make contact with you. And then look through these words so that you can be welcome into the village.
So it is a place of overcoming these boundaries, these differences, trying to bring a new reality into being by making it more familiar, making it more understandable, making it more human. These are important elements of how we step into change and difference for our future. The Making of Relatives ceremony that I have, I put it here again, is important because this teaches us how to build new relations. In our tradition, this extended into inter-tribal family relations where we would take a relative from another tradition. In our Stony tradition, there's a way that says if you see someone that looks like a relative who passed on, an uncle, a brother, someone who you have not seen in a long time, their familiarity is the spirit of that reaching out to you, to reconnect in some way, to give you hope, to give you a new balance, a new reality of understanding the world around you. And it's a comfort. And so we need to see each other in light of that, in the path that we move through this earth, that we will find a better form that will help us to be in relationship. As I close this, I wanted to just share this idea and one of the things that we will be doing this year is with the visit of Lois Wilson coming as a TRC commissioner, that she has written and has, with various celebrities, done this witness affirmation, a designation of people as a witness, because that empowers them and obligates them in a way to begin understanding the importance of what we are learning and how we are putting that into practice. So in some of the studies that I was doing this past fall, looking at the importance and relationship of these language trials that we have been going through, that in times from the Muslim community, there was a film that we watched that talked about women being, well, it said the men were an individual, but the women are a nation. And so this ability to be beyond what each individual is, and that empowerment to live into a broader sense of being and belonging gives us this sense that we are connecting in a different way with different responsibilities. In our tradition, we come from a matriarchal society in Morley, and oftentimes people say we come from a matriarchal society. Well, what does that really mean? In our tradition, the women held the rights to the land. They held the rights to the family. They held the rights to the housing, the teepee, the accommodation. They had the ability to depose a chief. They had their own language, their own customs, their own traditions, their own teachings, and they would pass this on in our customary way. And so this understanding of how we are venerating some of these teachings becomes very important, embedded in the way that we see the world and embedded in the way that we have a difference from the world that exists today. And so to witness this, to see this, to understand, and to bring that into the realm of our experience, the Holocaust survivor, Elie Wiesel, talks a bit about this importance of witnesses.
I believe firmly and profoundly that anyone who listens to a witness becomes a witness. So those who hear us, those who read us, those who learn something from us, they will continue to bear witness for us. Until now, they are doing it with us. At a certain point in time, they will do it for all of us.
This teaching is really important because, as we see in our collective memory, we tend to not recognize and not lift up the importance of what we are learning and how we are applying that to the world that we want to see. Oftentimes, we are inundated with information and we turn to the most convenient way to extract ourselves from that conversation. But this is really important. How we live into our understanding and how we build upon that understanding with the tools that we have been given by those who have undertaken this journey is very important. How we form relationships today in this city, in this time, in this country, in this society, is going to say very much more about us in the future and what we leave behind. So these things that we learned out of the reconciliation movement help us to ground ourselves in a real, lived, immutable experience that can help to shape what we want to see in the future. So for me, these are the thoughts around where we step into this conversation, how we apply and learn what we are gaining from one another in productive ways that will help to foster a better society for the future. And that's going to end there. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Reverend Snow. What we're going to do now, we have a half hour, if we want, for discussion. I'm just going to collect a couple of microphones, and I would please ask you to raise your hand, and we'll hand you the mic. The reason why you need to speak in the mic is so we can hear you, of course, but so we can record your questions and everybody can hear them. So just give me a moment, and I'll be right there. Okay. Can you hear me? Yes. Who would like to start our discussion? I can, if you. Reverend Snow, I wanted to ask, the question that comes up a lot in regard to tradition, especially in relation to religion, and in particular the religion of Christianity, is the passing on of tradition and how the youth responds to that, and where that future will be taken by the youth. And I know in a lot of churches today we experience not great attendance, etc. Do you have anything to say about this idea of the traditions and ways of knowing in the Stoney Nakoda tradition? Is there a parallel trend, or is there something more positive that you have noted?
I think some of this is sort of related to the deep and substantial ways that something other than one focus is given. So when we talk about the youth and those movements, a lot of it has to do with what they're seeing in the community. They're seeing environmental degradation. They're seeing the loss of life from their friends and loved ones who are committing suicide or succumbing to addiction. Others are seeing the corruption going on within communities. So there's a broad swath of experiences that are happening for young people, Indigenous people. I often think about, like in our Western tradition, you have a number of youth movements that kind of highlight different aspects of a culture. So sometimes it's rock and roll, sometimes it's other aspects, and those tend to form a youth cultural movement that changes the perspective of the society and moves it into some other form where it has to start developing a response. And sometimes that's negative, other times over time we see that becomes much more lenient and accepting and bridging these generational shifts that happen. And for the Indigenous communities, that would normally happen within the confines of a generational movement of elders learning from young people, or young people learning the ways and teachings of elders. And so this shift of information and the vitality of that information being put to use for the various community members, and the interconnectedness of that, because a reserve community, a First Nation, is basically a big family. And so the things that you do helping to protect your family, helping to nurture your family and those relationships, that they extend beyond what we see in terms of the impacts of the devastation that happens. So when the children were taken out of the homes during the residential school era, you vacuumed up a great deal of the cultural heart of the community. And this cultural genocide impacted the communities for generations to come, because when they came back, they were disenfranchised, they didn't know the language, they didn't know the customs, they couldn't carry on. And so these efforts have been amplified over time, where that initial, I would say, sin, the original sin of what was done to the Indigenous communities, has been reinforced by bureaucratic and administrative systems and ways that it's never been resolved for the community. What we've seen is the community then trying to reinvigorate through teachings. In Morley, we had the ecumenical conference, which was a reinstitution of Indigenous practice back in the 1970s, trying to reconnect us to our spiritual teachings, to our understandings, and to take away some of the prohibitions that were there, saying that this was a demonic thing, this was some, and even in our own communities, from the pulpit in the community, the reserved church, they would be preaching against the traditional practitioners. And so this polarization that happened because of this ongoing impact of these institutions wanting to degrade what our communities were about had to be overcome. And so since the 1970s, we've been trying to work toward building better relationships, better understandings, to try to dismantle and decolonize some of that impact and to regain some sense of who we are. But in many cases, it's coming too late for the young people who are struggling in this system where they can't get work, their economic prospects are not there, their education's programs are falling short. They don't have the resources, they don't have the community mentorship and the build-up to help them through. And all of these parts are necessary. We say it takes a community or a village to raise a child. That's what we're looking at.
Thank you so much. Yes, so we'll start back there. Oh, yeah, and then you're next. Okay.
Thank you very much for what you presented. I was struck by all the very familiar places and what they mean for the Indigenous community. And so I just am wondering, there's been a lot of effort in the past few years to create an Indigenous gathering place here in Calgary. And I'm wondering what your perspective is on that, given that there's these so many traditional and spiritual places, even within Calgary, why there would be this movement to create a new place. Is this like what we saw, the coming together and sharing of peace, or what is the motivation behind a new gathering place?
I've seen the formation of this since the 2000s, when I was working at City Hall. And one of the things that sort of came forward, it was a sort of a committee group that trying to find a place, and a place for mainly urban people to be able to have a sweat, to have a ceremonial place, and to try to work towards that. Not a lot of favor or discussion going on with the broader community. So the reserves, the First Nation groups, or the Métis groups that are here in this area. And so when you have sort of an isolated group trying to advocate, it makes it more difficult. And I think what I've often talked about in terms of what churches can be doing is to help break down some of those barriers and to bring the communities back alongside so that they are working in a communal way, in a way that makes sense. Because in Calgary, for us, the Stoney people, there are holy places still. There are significant places where that would be a unique observance to try to reaffirm that. It's not always that convenient. I mean, people want, they try to treat it like a church. Like a church can be here 1 minute, and if it runs out of money, it'll be torn down and put something else up. Or they don't have that sort of deep connectedness that we're talking about in terms of land-based investiture in what that looks like for various communities, how that becomes meaningful for various communities. So to try to bring that to the awareness of the group that's advocating, I mean, it's fine to advocate. It's fine to try to find a way in which we are going to lift up some of these absences that are happening. But I think there's some nurture and there's some perspective that can be added from Indigenous elders from the area, from different communities, who can add to that in their voices. And it's not merely one group saying, this is the silver bullet for all the things that ail us. But we can try to find a way to remember where these spaces are meaningful in our lives and how they are threatened or activated in other ways. Because when we see things like the US that had the Line 3 that went down and became that Dakota Access Pipeline, once the Indigenous people told where their sacred areas were, they were demolished. They were taken and obliterated from the earth because of that impact. And so we need to find a way where we're going to be respecting one another. And I think that is the first step versus trying to solidify it in a place that might not exist for some. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question about the land, and you've been mentioning it a little bit, but the power of land and having land and who owns the land, and it's all about the land, our relationship or the loss of land. And it was interesting that in order to reclaim the land, for Stoney and Dakota and for other Indigenous communities, having a name for them and identifying the names have been there for eons, makes us as settler communities realize that there is a claim and then is based on history and tradition and that, which it's fascinating to see all the names. I was unaware of those. And I would imagine there's a lot more names, for the Bow River, the Elbow, or, Big Hill Creek, or any of these other places. And so I'm just wondering how one could find out more about those names.
There's been several studies over the years. A lot of times, because of, like, even with the Stoney tribe wanting to rename certain places, those have entered the public consciousness through lawsuits or other types of activity, so they become painted in a certain way. And so that's a difficult thing to be open about. But I think in areas where we have that conversation, this is a perfect place to have that conversation. This is a perfect place to bring that awareness. Even though its history is problematic, you take that on as part of this way of knowing of the land and of that connection to the land. So, okay. And I'd like to, after this, ask John to say a few words. Go ahead.
Ishnish.
Ashnish.
Papas Chase Cree scholar Dwayne Donald speaks of colonization as multiple sites of relationship denial. So we deny our relationship to Creator, we deny our relationship to each other. We're no longer kin. Or we deny our relationship to the land and exploit it. As a settler who is a visitor on this land, how might you encourage us to repair our relationship with land in a way that doesn't appropriate, but yet still respects the teachings that come from the land in this place? Because especially as Christians, we follow a faith that is actually from a different land, and we've truncated that.
Yeah.
And therefore, the doctrine of discovery, how on earth did that come from Christianity? Yet it did. And I wonder if it's because of that truncation, and it's this lack of, Dwayne Donald speaks of decolonizing is actually unlearning colonization, so that you become kin to me, and therefore I have responsibility. The land, I am in relationship because I believe the land is a being, and I am therefore responsible, and then also to Creator. I just wonder if you could comment on that.
A little, and thank you for that, Felix. That's really, that really gets to the heart of what we were trying to talk about here. And that in these efforts, our interpretation and our way of interpreting are often, we have to overcome quite a bit of history, quite a bit of understanding in order to do that. And whether or not many of us outside would be capable of that, and what that would mean. When I think about this, I had a whole section here written about sort of Christianity within this context, and I'll just read a portion of that, because one of the things that we had been hearing in the past little while was about these ideas about reconciliation. The Professor Rabbi Dr. Laura Duhan Kaplan from Vancouver School of Theology talked a bit about this in relationship to the story of Joseph and his brothers, and that mode of reconciliation that becomes apparent through these relational ties, and what that can mean to how we form relationship in and amongst groups that have very different backgrounds, very different histories, and very different ways of engaging with this for meaningful outcomes that we want to see out of that. Because we often in Christianity think about the resurrection and the ascension, and not really too much about the crucifixion part, not about sort of the turmoil and the harshness of what we need to overcome and come through. When I think about some of this practice, the place that I go to is within the Eucharist. And because the Eucharist has been taken as ceremony, it has these underpinnings of a way of practice that is taking, as we would from the Lakota tradition, you have the tradition of the pipe from the Buffalo Calf woman who passes this pipe on and tells them how to use it and tells them what to do, and then leaves, goes into the next world, and this practice is continued on in this space. And so that's sort of when I see the Eucharist in practice, it is Christ passing along this teaching and bringing together something of the blood, which is the wine, the spirit, and the body, the bread, that way of putting these two things together into another form of creation, into a new sort of being. And this effort to amalgamate those teachings into something, because we're doing a very, to me, a godlike act. And that is the nature around ceremony, that it is about trying to reach up to a better understanding. And that if we can get to that without condemning one another, without sidelining one another from not being able to practice that, or not being able to do this, or you're doing it wrong, and this sort of thing, that if we are accepting of what that means and what it looks like in these contexts, what does that mean for Indigenous people? How can we find relation to our practice that is meaningful to us in a way that helps and supports. I just want to read this one portion by from the Pope Francis's encyclical that came out in 2020 on beloved Amazonia. And this is from chapter 82, and he says, "In the Eucharist, God, in the culmination of the mystery of the Incarnation, chose to reach our intimate depths through the fragment of matter. The Eucharist joins heaven and earth. It embraces and penetrates all creation. For this reason, it can be a motivation of our concerns for the environment, directing us to be stewards of all creation. In this sense, encountering God does not mean fleeing from this world or turning our backs on nature. It means that we can take up into the liturgy many elements proper to the experience of Indigenous peoples in their contact with nature, the respect native forms of expression in song, dance, rituals, and gestures. The Second Vatican Council called for this effort to inculturate the liturgy among Indigenous peoples. Over 50 years have passed, and we still have a long way to go along these lines. And so trying to learn this expression and interest from one another is, to me, that key. It is the ongoing nature of why we say it is a living gospel, that it brings to us interpretation, and it brings this opportunity for discussion. So, I don't know. Maybe John Whitman. Do you want to come up?
It's easier to talk from here. Thank you. I have a disability, but I'm thankful for Tony is following our father's footsteps, the late Reverend Chief John Snow. So what I wanted to echo and encourage you is, as students of religious studies, as students of theology, I would encourage you to start reading some of the Indigenous authors. So one of the books Tony shared tonight was from my father's publication, "These Mountains Are Our Sacred Places." As settlers, you should know this part of our history, part of our story. It's written by Chief John Snow. These mountains are our sacred places. Now, for our removal from the mountains, there's a work that's entitled Spirits of the Rockies. That was written by Dr. Courtney Mason. Those books give a history of the Stoney people. In the Spirits of the Rockies, it captures our removal, forced removal from the Banff National Park area and the jailing. We were put in jail at Canmore. That's part of your history. You should know that as a settler. The other thing I would also encourage you to understand is the creation of Banff National Park. It was created as a conservation area, a conservation undertaking by the government. What I would say is, because the Stonies were imprisoned, conservation in this country starts with our incarceration. That's the real beginning of conservation. So the Spirits of the Rockies, I encourage you to read. These Mountains Are Sacred Places by Chief John Snow. And then the religious movement. I would ask each and every one of you, what happened in the 1960s, 1970s within religious circles? Revival happened. And so too, we had a revival. And this is captured in that book, Around the Sacred Fire, by Professor James Treat. He talks about our ecumenical conference. So that in part, Professor, answers your first question. Our parallels with Christianity were encapsulated in that movement, that gathering and coming together and having that insight where we can share our ceremonies. And so the sacred place that we gathered was at the Stony Indian Park. That's where we gathered with 10 to 15, 20,000 people over 20, 30 years. And the simple message there was, please learn your language, learn your ceremonies, and understand that. Go back home and teach your people. So we had people from all over North America come to Morley. And now, today, as Tony said, we have world leaders coming to Ka'inashke. Ka'inashke is a holy area. So here we get refuge. We seek refuge in the secret place of the Most High. What does that sound like? Sounds like Psalm 91. So we have teachings very close to Christianity. I often teach in the schools and in the seminaries, and I tell them, we have ceremonies. One of our ceremonies on the West Coast was the potlatch. In that ceremony, we shared 90% of our earthly wealth. We shared that in ceremony. What do you think that would do to Christianity? What do we share in Christianity? 10%. And that's if we don't hide it with the tax man. So I think Christianity has a lot to learn from Indigenous people. One of our elders talks about perspective. And this perspective is in my dad's book, That Mountain, Iamnaska. If you look at the south side, it's a sheer cliff, flat face of a rock. On the west side, it's a part of a continuous range. Behind that mountain, you'll find glacier features. On the eastern edge, you'll find a treed canopy. So if we think as Western thinkers, which description is right? The elder would say there is no right. There's only different perspectives. Each one can be right in its own way. But in Western teaching, we're saying there's only one religion. There's only one way. But there are many ways in practical reality. So we bring an experiential knowing. That's what Tony was talking about. The other book that's not up there is The Making of Relatives. That comes from The Sacred Pipe by Black Elk. So I would encourage you to read that. That talks about Matohoshila and the making of relatives. Matohoshila becomes part of a ceremony. And rather than having violence like they do today, they have ceremony and they make peace with one another. So coming back to the original question, what can we do? I would encourage you to read these Indigenous authors, these perspectives of Indigenous narratives. So we come to a greater understanding, because we don't learn this in school. And that is part of our travesty, because we're colonized the way we think. We have to decolonize that. And part of that begins tonight with the talk from Tony. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been important, and I want to thank John for his words and his work, because he was the one who, after they had an award for professors designated from the University of Calgary, he established a scholarship for students, Indigenous students and others who are entering into the University of Calgary. And that has been there for over 10 years, contributing, I think it's $1,500 every year to a student who is awarded that scholarship. And so we try to continue this work, even though it's difficult. We encourage others to do this work. We see from major multinational organizations that are out there promoting this type of thing, not giving that investment, not giving that credence to our elders, to our people, to these teachings. And we think that's important, that this change that we want, that we see in the work that we do, is something we have to advocate for and something we have to work towards in our places of work, places of worship, in the societies that we want to build.
And everybody, please join me in thanking Reverend Tony Smith. That's it.
Well, thank you all for coming.